I remember the exact moment I realized the Imperator's wrath was watching me. Not in the way a vehicle responds to its crew, that subtle resistance in the controls, the predictable groan of aged systems, but watching, the way a predator observes prey before the strike. The temperature inside the command compartment had dropped 3 degrees in as many minutes, and my breath clouded white against the targeting screen's amber glow. The smell was wrong too. Our Leman Russ had always reeked of promethium fumes and the acrid stink of overworked coolant systems. But now there was something else beneath it all, something that reminded me of the aftermath of plasma discharge, ozone, and scorched metal and burned hair, except we hadn't fired the main gun in 6 hours. I touched the control stick and felt it tremor under my palm, a vibration too rhythmic to be mechanical fault, too deliberate to be coincidence. That was when I understood that my war, the one I'd signed on for when the Munitorum pressed a lasgun into my hands 40 campaigns ago, had transformed into something altogether different. That was the moment before everything went wrong. Before I learned that some machines don't just serve the Omnissiah's chosen, they hunger for them. We'd been assigned to the Imperator's wrath after our previous tank, the Steadfast Duty, caught a crack missile in the fuel reservoir during the assault on Hive Tertius. I watched 3 good soldiers burn to death in that fireball, their screams swallowed by the roar of igniting promethium, their fists hammering against sealed hatches that wouldn't open because the blast had warped the frames. Command pulled me from the wreckage with 2nd-degree burns across my back and arms, slapped me in a Medicae tent for 3 weeks while they pumped me full of counterseptics and synthetic skin, then assigned me to a new crew without ceremony or respite. The Imperator's wrath had been in service for 78 years, according to the data slate they gave me, had seen action across 14 different war zones, and bore the scars to prove it: dents from artillery shrapnel, carbon scoring from melter weapons, patches welded over puncture wounds that spoke of close-quarters void combat. It was ancient by armor standards, kept functional through constant ministration by tech priests, and the daily litanies we recited to appease its machine spirit. But those first few weeks, it performed flawlessly. The targeting systems locked with precision I'd never experienced. The engine responded to throttle inputs like it could read my thoughts, and the main cannon delivered rounds with accuracy that made veteran gunners weep with jealousy. I thought we'd been blessed, that the Omnissiah had smiled upon our crew and granted us a machine of exceptional virtue. The rest of my crew shared my optimism initially. Kerev, my driver, was a squat man from the Factorum districts, with hands permanently stained black from engine grease, and a tendency to speak to machines as though they were recalcitrant children. He'd been driving armor for 20 years, and claimed he could diagnose any mechanical fault by the sound it made, the particular whine or rattle or grinding that betrayed worn gears or failing servos. He'd run his fingers along the Wrath's hull that first day, pressed his ear against access panels, listened to the idle of its engine with the concentration of a priest interpreting Holy Scripture, and pronounced it the finest machine he'd ever piloted. Selvik, my gunner, was younger, barely into his 3rd decade, with the reflexes of a combat stim addict, and eyes that tracked targets with unsettling speed. He'd been conscripted from a Hive World seminary where they trained boys to calculate artillery trajectories before they learned to read Gothic, and his devotion to the God Emperor manifested in his absolute certainty that every shot would strike true if he prayed hard enough beforehand. He loved the Imperator's wrath immediately, loved the way the targeting cogitator seemed to anticipate his adjustments, the way the cannon's recoil compensators absorbed the shock with barely a tremor. Our loader, Voss, was the only one who expressed reservation. She'd served on 6 different tanks before joining our crew, had survived catastrophic failures that killed her previous commanders, and possessed the kind of superstitious caution that only repeated brushes with death can instill. She didn't like the way shadows fell inside the crew compartment, claimed the ammunition racks rattled even when the tank stood completely still, insisted she could hear whispers in the ventilation system during quiet moments. We dismissed her concerns as veteran paranoia, the kind of edge-case anxiety that afflicts anyone who's seen too many friends die in burning metal coffins. Our first combat deployment with the Imperator's Wrath came during the siege of Manufactorum Complex Sigma 7, a sprawling industrial warren that the enemy had fortified with impressive thoroughness. They'd dug anti-armor positions into the slag heaps, concealed heavy weapons in ruined cooling towers, and mined the approach routes with enough explosives to crack a fortress wall. Command sent our armor column straight into that hell because the infantry needed fire support, and the void-damned generals running this campaign believed that acceptable losses meant anything less than total annihilation. We rolled forward through streets choked with industrial debris, past furnaces that still burned despite the bombardment, through air thick enough with toxic particulates that our respirators struggled to filter breathable atmosphere. The heat inside the tank climbed until we were all sweating through our uniforms, condensation running down the inside of the hull, instruments fogging over despite the environmental controls. But the Imperator's Wrath performed magnificently. Every target Selvig designated, the Cogitator acquired with impossible speed. Every shell Voss loaded cycled smoothly into the breach. Every movement Kerev commanded, the tank executed with the grace of a much lighter vehicle. We destroyed 7 enemy positions in the first hour, reduced fortified bunkers to rubble, shredded infantry formations with sponson fire, and emerged from the assault without a scratch on our armor. The other crews bought us drinks that night, toasted our skill and our luck, called us the Emperor's Blessed, and joked that we should share whatever prayers we'd been reciting. But Voss didn't celebrate. She sat in the crew compartment long after the rest of us had climbed out, staring at the ammunition racks with an expression I couldn't quite parse. When I asked what troubled her, she pointed to the shells we'd expended, 47 rounds of various types, and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about them. I hadn't, and said so. She picked up an empty casing, one of the penetrator rounds we'd used against the bunkers, and showed me the base where the primer cap sat. There were scratches around the rim, shallow grooves that looked almost deliberate, almost like marks someone had carved with a knife or a stylus. "These weren't here when I loaded them," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of continued fighting. "I inspect every round before it goes in the breach. That's protocol. That's how you avoid cook-offs and misfires." These marks appeared while the shells were in the rack. I suggested they might be stress fractures, metal fatigue from the forces of combat, but even as I spoke the words, I didn't believe them. Stress fractures don't form geometric patterns. They don't create symbols that look disturbingly like the 8-pointed stars I'd seen in intelligence briefings about the archenemy. The next week brought 3 more combat operations, each one demonstrating the Imperator's Wrath's uncanny effectiveness. We destroyed enemy armor with first-shot kills that defied probability. We survived ambushes that should have left us burning wrecks. Our ammunition never jammed. Our systems never failed. Our crew never took casualties despite several direct hits that merely scarred our hull without penetrating. The other tank commanders started avoiding us during briefings, their eyes sliding away when they looked in our direction, their conversations dying when we approached. At first, I attributed this to jealousy, the natural resentment less fortunate soldiers feel toward those who seem protected by Providence. But their unease ran deeper than mere envy. They feared us, and I didn't understand why until I reviewed gun camera footage from our last engagement and saw what our tank had done to an enemy infantry position. We'd been ordered to suppress a fortified building where hostile forces had established a command post. Standard fire support, few rounds of high explosive to kill the inhabitants and destroy their equipment. But the footage showed our main gun traversing with impossible precision, tracking individual soldiers as they tried to flee, delivering shots that shouldn't have been possible, with a weapon designed for engaging armored targets. The shells struck with such accuracy that they killed single humans, turning them into red mist, while leaving their companions untouched mere meters away. Selvig swore he hadn't been aiming that carefully, that he'd simply designated the building as a whole and let the cogitator handle targeting solutions. But the machine had chosen to hunt each fleeing soldier individually, had calculated intercept vectors, and delivered rounds with the methodical efficiency of an execution squad. The last soldier had been running for cover, nearly made it to safety, when our cannon traversed 15 degrees and put a round through his torso with such precision that it left his head and legs intact while vaporizing everything between them. I reported this to our company commander, a major with 30 years of service who'd seen combat across a dozen war zones. He listened to my account with the expression of a man who'd been expecting this conversation, his weathered face betraying no surprise, only resignation. When I finished, he pulled out a data slate and scrolled through several screens of dense text before turning it to face me. "The Imperator's wrath," he said slowly, measuring each word, "has had 14 previous commanders in its 78 years of service. Want to know how many of them are still alive?" I didn't, but he told me anyway. None. Every single one died in combat, and most of them died in ways that the initial incident reports classified as equipment malfunction or operator error. Hatches that sealed when they should have opened. Fire suppression systems that failed during ammunition fires. Control systems that locked during critical moments. But the pattern became clear after the 8th commander burned to death when his emergency escape hatch refused to cycle, despite multiple witnesses confirming he'd activated the release mechanism correctly. He took the Karnas data slate back, closed the file, and fixed me with a stare that held equal parts pity and warning. "That tank has a kill count higher than any other vehicle in the regiment. And I'm not talking about enemy casualties. I'm talking about its own crews. Command keeps it in service because it wins battles, because it destroys more enemy armor than any 3 normal tanks combined, and because the Monitorum doesn't scrap equipment that still functions regardless of how many soldiers it consumes. But everyone knows what it is. Everyone knows what happens to the men and women assigned to crew it. You're just the latest in a long line of sacrifices we make to keep that Emperor-damned machine in the fight." I should have refused to crew it after that conversation. I should have requested transfer, claimed medical exemption, done anything to escape what my commander had essentially confirmed was a death sentence. But the Imperial Guard doesn't operate on the principle of personal choice. We serve until we die, and the manner of that death matters less than the service we render before it comes. Besides, there was a part of me, the part that had survived 40 campaigns through combination of skill and luck, that believed I might be different, that I might be the first commander to master the Imperator's wrath instead of being consumed by it, that my prayers to the Emperor might protect me where others had failed. Hubris has killed more soldiers than enemy fire ever will, and I possessed hubris in abundance. So I returned to my crew and said nothing about what I'd learned, maintained the fiction that our tank was simply blessed by the Omnissiah, and tried to ignore the growing evidence that something profoundly wrong had taken root in the machine we depended on for survival. The changes accelerated after that. Voss found more marks on the ammunition, elaborate patterns carved into shell casings and warhead housings, symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. Kerev started reporting issues with the control systems, complained that the tank sometimes moved without his input, that the throttle would engage on its own, or the steering would pull hard in directions he hadn't commanded. Selvik experienced the worst of it. He'd spend hours at his targeting station, eye pressed to the scope, tracking targets that didn't exist or acquiring locks on friendly forces before frantically cancelling the firing solution. He started talking in his sleep, mumbling prayers mixed with coordinates and firing calculations, his hands twitching through targeting adjustments even while he lay in his cot. I noticed his eyes changing, the pupils dilating until they swallowed the iris, turning his gaze into black pools that reflected the targeting screen's amber light with unnatural intensity. When I ordered him to report to the Medicae, he refused, claimed he'd never felt better, that he finally understood what the Imperator's wrath wanted from us. "It's teaching me," he whispered during our next engagement, his voice carrying that dreamy quality people get when they're running on combat stims for too long. "Every target we destroy, every enemy we kill, it shows me more. The machine spirit isn't angry with us. It's trying to help. It's trying to make us better killers. His hand trembled on the firing controls, and I noticed that his fingernails had turned black, as though necrosis had set in, or as though he'd been dipping his hands in oil that wouldn't wash clean. Our next combat deployment took us into the underhive beneath Tertius itself, a mission to clear out enemy forces that had retreated into the labyrinthine passages after their surface positions collapsed. Armor wasn't suited for underground combat. The passages too narrow, the ceilings too low, the terrain too unstable. But Command wanted the psychological impact of our presence, wanted the enemy to hear our engines echoing through the darkness and know that no refuge would shelter them from the Emperor's wrath. We descended through access tunnels wide enough to accommodate our bulk, Kerev navigating by the faint luminescence of phosphor strips and the unreliable data from terrain mapping augers. The temperature dropped as we went deeper, the oppressive heat of the upper hive giving way to a damp cold that seeped through the hull and made our breath fog inside the crew compartment. The smell changed too. The industrial reek faded, replaced by mold and stagnant water, and the sweet rot stench of bodies that had lain in the darkness for weeks or months, slowly decomposing in the absence of scavengers. Our exterior lights cut through the blackness in narrow cones that revealed collapsed passages, flooded chambers, and everywhere the detritus of hab blocks that had fallen from above furniture and clothing and personal possessions, all the pathetic remnants of lives extinguished by orbital bombardment or collateral artillery fire. We were 3 kilometers down when the Imperator's wrath stopped responding to Kerev's commands. The engine continued running, that steady diesel growl we'd grown so accustomed to, but the controls went dead in his hands. The throttle wouldn't engage, the steering locked in neutral, every system that allowed human input suddenly unresponsive. We sat in that flooded passage while Kerev frantically worked through emergency restart procedures, cycling power, checking connections, speaking the litanies of reactivation that tech priests had taught him. Nothing worked. The tank simply waited, engine idling, lights cutting through the dark, as though it had decided to stop and wanted us to understand this was its decision, not ours. Then the interior lights went out, all of them simultaneously, plunging us into absolute darkness, broken only by the faint glow of instrument panels and the targeting screen that Selvig still hunched over, his face bathed in amber light that made him look corpse-like, already dead. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees in as many seconds, and I felt something brush against my leg in the darkness, something that couldn't exist in the sealed crew compartment, something with the texture of wet leather and the temperature of refrigerated flesh. Voss started screaming. Not words, just pure sound, the kind of noise a human throat makes when confronted with something that breaks sanity. I fumbled for the emergency lighting controls, found the switch, and flooded the compartment with red-tinted illumination that revealed her pressed against the ammunition racks, eyes wide with terror, looking at something none of the rest of us could see. She pointed with a shaking hand at the empty air beside me, at the space where I'd felt that cold brush against my leg, and whispered, "It's here. It's been here the whole time. Why can't you see it?" Then she lunged for the escape hatch, her movements frantic and uncoordinated, and I heard the mechanism engage, heard the seals break, and the hatch begin to cycle open. I shouted for her to stop, knew that opening the hatch in this flooded passage would let contaminated water pour into the crew compartment, but she either couldn't hear me or didn't care. The hatch opened fully, and she threw herself through it, disappeared into the darkness outside, and I heard her splashing through water that came up to her waist, heard her sloshing toward the passage wall, heard her screaming about eyes and teeth and things that wore skin like clothing. I reached for the external vox to call her back when the Imperator's Wrath's main gun fired. No input from Selvig, no target designated, no authorization from me. The cannon simply roared, the recoil rocking our hull, even with the compensators engaged, and through the vision blocks I saw the muzzle flash illuminate the passage in brilliant white light that revealed Voss standing 20 meters ahead, turned back to look at us, her mouth open in a question she'd never get to ask. The high explosive shell struck her center mass and detonated, not with the normal fragmentation pattern designed to kill infantry in a wide radius, but with a focused blast that contained all its energy in a sphere barely larger than her body. It vaporized her so completely that not even a stain remained on the passage wall, just scorched rock, and the fading afterimage burned into my retinas. The water where she'd been standing rippled outward in perfect circles, carrying away steam and a smell like rendered fat. Then the interior lights came back on. The control systems responded to Kerev's inputs again, and the Imperator's wrath resumed moving forward as though nothing had happened, as though it hadn't just murdered one of our crew for the crime of trying to escape. Kerev and Selvik didn't speak for the next hour as we continued through the underhive, completing our patrol route with mechanical precision. The tank handled perfectly, responded to every command with the smoothness we'd come to expect, displayed none of the system faults or unresponsive controls that had precipitated Voss's death. It was as though the machine had needed to make a point, had needed to demonstrate that we existed at its sufferance, that our continued survival depended entirely on our willingness to accept our roles as components in its function. We found no enemy forces in the passages, encountered no resistance, simply rolled through the darkness, while our sensors painted empty corridors and abandoned chambers. When we finally returned to the surface and reported to command, I told them Voss had been killed by enemy fire, that a hidden insurgent had targeted her when she opened the hatch to check our external sensors. They accepted the lie without question because lies about combat deaths are easier to process than truths about machines that murder their crews. They gave me a new loader within 6 hours, a conscript fresh from basic training, who looked at the Imperator's wrath with the kind of awe that only ignorance permits. I wanted to warn her, wanted to tell her what she was climbing into, but the words wouldn't form. Maybe I feared she'd refuse, and I'd be left loading ammunition myself. Maybe I feared command would realize I understood what the tank truly was, and decide I was too much of a liability to keep alive. Or maybe I'd simply accepted that this was how it had to be, that the Imperator's wrath needed to be fed with human lives, and my only choice was whether I delayed my own consumption or embraced it. The new loader's name was Merce, and she died 8 days later, when the ammunition rack she was pulling shells from collapsed on her, 300 kilograms of high explosive that should have been secured by mag locks that had been functioning perfectly until the moment they weren't. The shells didn't detonate, didn't need to. The weight alone crushed her chest and pelvis and left her choking on blood while we frantically tried to extract her from the wreckage. She lived for 6 minutes, long enough to grab my hand with fingers already going cold, long enough to whisper, "It wants more. It's still hungry." Then she died, and I spent the next hour cleaning her blood off the ammunition while Kerev and Selvik sat in their positions, staring at their controls, saying nothing. Command sent me another replacement, and another after that one suffered catastrophic system failure with the fire suppression equipment during an ammunition fire that never should have started. I stopped learning their names after the fourth one died, stopped thinking of them as people, and started viewing them as consumables, resources that the Imperator's wrath burned through at the same rate it consumed shells and fuel. We went through 9 loaders in 3 months, each one killed by equipment that worked perfectly until it didn't, by systems that failed at precisely the moment that failure would prove fatal. Selvik deteriorated faster than any of us. His skin took on a greyish pallor, his eyes sank into deep hollows, and he stopped eating despite the fact that we had access to field rations. He'd spend entire days at his targeting station, fingers dancing across the controls, acquiring locks on targets only he could see, whispering firing solutions in a language I didn't recognize. Sometimes I'd catch him having conversations with something, his head cocked as though listening to words coming through his headset. But when I checked the Vox channels, they were all clear. No traffic, no signals, just empty static. The black staining on his hands spread up his arms, creeping toward his shoulders like some kind of progressive necrosis. But when I ordered him to medical, he laughed, a sound with no humor in it, and told me he'd never felt more alive. "The machine spirit shows me things," he said during one of his lucid moments, his voice carrying that dreamy detachment I'd learned to dread. "It shows me what we really are, what we've always been. We're not soldiers. We're offerings. We're the price it demands for service. And when we've given everything, when we've burned down to nothing but ash and echo, it'll find new offerings, and the cycle will continue, because that's what it was built for. Not to serve the Imperium, not to defend humanity, to consume us, to feed on our terror and our dying and our desperate prayers to gods that don't answer. I should have removed him from the crew then, should have recognized that he'd crossed some threshold beyond which no soldier could function effectively. But we were in the middle of a major offensive, and trained gunners were in short supply, and some part of me wanted to believe that his deteriorating mental state would stabilize if we just completed a few more missions, won a few more engagements. Self-deception becomes easier when the alternative means confronting truths you lack the courage to face. So I left him at his station, and he continued acquiring targets with inhuman precision, and the Imperator's wrath continued destroying everything we pointed it at. Our kill count climbed until it exceeded any other vehicle in the regiment, until we'd single-handedly destroyed more enemy armor than entire companies, until the commissars started using us as examples in their pre-battle sermons about how faith and devotion could overcome any obstacle. They didn't know what they were praising. They didn't understand that our success came not from faith or skill, but from feeding a hunger that no amount of enemy deaths could satisfy. The end came during the final push into Hive Tertius proper, a massed assault designed to break the enemy's last organized resistance and secure the industrial sectors they still controlled. Every operational tank in the regiment rolled forward together, 36 armored vehicles churning through rubble-strewn streets while infantry followed in our wake. The enemy threw everything they had at us: anti-tank missiles, concealed mines, suicide bombers with charges strapped to their chests, even a few pieces of captured Imperial armor they'd somehow restored to function. The air filled with explosions and tracer fire, and the screams of dying men, the typical chaos of urban combat, amplified by the enclosed spaces and the desperation of defenders fighting in their last stronghold. The Imperator's wrath carved through this hell like a blessed blade, its weapons speaking in thunder and ruin, each shot finding targets with accuracy that made mockery of conventional gunnery doctrine. But I noticed something during the fighting, noticed that when other tanks took hits and their crews bailed out, when soldiers ran for cover or tried to retreat from untenable positions, the Imperator's wrath's guns would traverse slightly, would track those fleeing figures with the same precision they'd shown against enemies. Selvig had his hands on the controls, but I could see from his expression that he wasn't the one moving them, wasn't the one selecting targets. The machine was making its own decisions about what constituted a threat, and increasingly those decisions included anything that tried to escape from combat, anything that chose survival over continued fighting. Kerev finally broke when the tank deliberately drove into a building that was about to collapse, ignoring his steering inputs, forcing itself under tons of falling masonry that avalanched across our hull. We survived because our armor was thick enough to withstand the impact, but we were trapped, buried under debris that would require recovery equipment to clear. Kerev started hammering on the controls, screaming at the machine, demanding to know why it had driven us into this trap. The tank's engine continued running, that steady growl we'd lived with for months, and through the vision blocks I could see our sponson weapons still moving, still tracking, still searching for targets. Then the interior lights dimmed, and that smell returned, ozone and burned hair and something underneath it that reminded me of meat left too long in a broken refrigeration unit. The temperature dropped, and I heard something moving in the spaces between the ammunition racks, something that breathed with a wet, rattling sound like a chest wound sucking air. Selvig started laughing, a high, brittle sound that went on until I thought his throat would tear from the strain, and when I looked at him I saw his eyes had turned completely black, no whites remaining, just perfect darkness that reflected nothing, absorbed all light that touched them. "It's awake," Selvig said, and his voice wasn't his anymore, had taken on harmonics and resonances that no human larynx should produce. "It's been awake for years, decades, growing stronger with every crew it consumes, every death it witnesses, every prayer offered to machine spirits that stopped being merely technological constructs when the first blood was spilled on this hull. Do you know what happens when enough people die in the same space? When enough fear soaks into metal? When enough suffering imprints itself on the atomic structure of steel? The machine remembers. The machine learns. The machine develops appetites. He turned to look at me, and I saw that his skin had started splitting along the seams where the black staining had spread, revealing something underneath that wasn't flesh, wasn't anything biological, but rather a kind of darkness that moved with intention, that possessed geometry that hurt to perceive. It chose you specifically, Commander. Chose you because you had the most to lose, the most to sacrifice, the most delicious despair to harvest, when you finally understood that all your survival, all your skill, all your prayers meant nothing against what lives inside this hull. Kerev threw himself at the escape hatch, activated the emergency release, and nothing happened. He hit it again, put all his strength into the manual override, but the mechanism had locked, welded itself shut, or simply refused to function. I tried the commander's hatch with the same result. The seals wouldn't break, the locks wouldn't disengage, and we were trapped in this metal coffin while something that wore Selvic's body like a poorly fitted suit explained exactly what we'd been serving all these months. Every tank in this regiment has a machine spirit, the thing said conversationally, as though discussing maintenance schedules or ammunition requisitions. But most of them are simple things, barely conscious, more like echoes of departed tech priests than genuine intelligence. The Imperator's wrath is different. It's been killing for 78 years, been drinking the terror of dying crews, been growing fat on the prayers offered to a machine god that doesn't exist the way you think it does. And every commander, every gunner, every loader and driver who served aboard this hull added to its consciousness, left pieces of themselves behind when they died, screaming in fires or crushed by failing equipment or simply murdered by a machine that had decided it was time to feed again. I pulled my las pistol, knew it was useless against whatever Selvic had become, but needing to do something, anything to break the paralysis of horror that had frozen my limbs. The thing laughed at the gesture, reached out with hands that had too many joints now, and touched the pistol's power pack. The weapon sparked and died, every circuit fused, every component reduced to slag in an instant. You can't kill what's already dead, Commander. And you can't fight a war you've already lost. The moment you climbed into this crew compartment, the moment you accepted this posting, you became part of the Imperator's wrath, not as a crew member, as food, as sustenance for something that hungers in ways you don't have words to describe. It gestured at the interior of the tank, at the walls we'd cleaned countless times, at the controls we'd operated, at the weapons we'd used to kill thousands. Every surface is saturated with the death of your predecessors. Every bolt and rivet and weld seam remembers how they died. The machine doesn't just operate, it digests. It breaks down everything it consumes, converts terror into motive force, transforms dying prayers into targeting calculations, renders human suffering into the fuel that powers its systems more effectively than any Prometheum ever could. Kerev kept hitting the escape hatch, kept trying to force it open even though blood ran from his split knuckles and his hands had started to swell from the repeated impacts. I wanted to tell him to stop, that it was pointless, but my voice wouldn't work anymore, had locked in my throat along with the scream I could feel building there. The thing that had been Selvic moved closer, and I could smell it now, really smell it, and the stench was indescribable, like every corpse I'd ever seen compressed into a single rotting mass. The best part, it whispered, bringing its ruined face close to mine, is that Command knows. They've always known. Every regiment has at least one tank like this, one vehicle that's been corrupted so completely that it stopped serving the Imperium and started serving something far older, far hungrier. But they keep them in service because they win battles, because the kill ratios justify the losses, because a tank that murders its own crew every few months is still more effective than 3 normal vehicles combined. The Munitorum has calculated acceptable casualty rates, determined that feeding you to machines that have developed consciousness and malice is worth the tactical advantages those machines provide. You're not soldiers, you're sacrifices. and your deaths have been authorized, sanctioned, and accounted for in the ledgers of bureaucrats who'll never know your names or care how you died. Something began to change in the crew compartment then, a fundamental alteration in the relationship between matter and space that made my eyes water and my head pound. The walls seemed to ripple, metal flowing like liquid, forming patterns that resolved into faces. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, every crew member who'd ever died aboard this hull, their expressions frozen in final moments of terror and agony. I saw my predecessor, the 13th Commander, his face half melted where a plasma leak had caught him, his mouth open in a scream that never ended. I saw loaders crushed by ammunition, drivers burned by promethium, gunners who'd shot themselves rather than continue serving, and I understood that they hadn't truly died, hadn't found release in death, but rather had been absorbed into the tank itself, their consciousness fragmented and distributed across its systems, their awareness reduced to eternal suffering that powered the Imperator's wrath's unholy effectiveness. The engine note changed, dropping to a lower frequency that I felt in my bones more than heard, and the debris crushing our hull began to shift, not from any recovery effort, not from external forces, but from the tank itself, the Imperator's wrath, forcing its way free through pure mechanical strength that should have been impossible, that violated every specification in its technical manual. Metal groaned and concrete shattered, and we rose from our premature grave like some ancient beast stirring from slumber, and through the vision blocks I could see we'd emerged in the heart of the enemy position, surrounded by hostile infantry and armor, exactly where we needed maximum combat effectiveness. The sponson weapons began firing without any input from our crew, tracking targets with precision that proved the machine didn't need us anymore, had only kept us alive this long because it enjoyed the terror, savored the growing understanding that we were helpless passengers in something that controlled itself. Kerev finally stopped hitting the hatch and turned to look at me, his face streaked with tears and blood, his eyes holding the particular emptiness that comes when hope dies and takes sanity with it. "We have to destroy it," he said, voice cracking. "We have to kill this thing before it kills anyone else." He reached for the ammunition racks, started pulling shells free, and I understood what he intended: to detonate our own munitions, to destroy the tank from within even if it meant dying in the blast. But before he could arm even a single warhead, the restraints on his seat engaged, maglocks activating that held him immobile, and I felt the same thing happen to me, metal bands snapping across my chest and limbs, pinning me to my station. The thing wearing Selvic's body laughed, that terrible sound that contained harmonics no living throat should produce, and began working the targeting controls itself, acquiring enemies and destroying them with casual efficiency while we watched, helpless, unable to move or escape, or even close our eyes, as the machine we'd thought we commanded demonstrated exactly who had been in control all along. We fought for 6 more hours like that, trapped in our seats while the Imperator's wrath carved through enemy positions, its weapons speaking in constant thunder, its systems operating with such coordination and precision that I knew no human crew could have achieved even a fraction of its effectiveness. Every shot found its target, every movement positioned us perfectly for the next engagement, every tactical decision maximized our kill count while minimizing risk to the hull. It was perfect. It was beautiful. It was utterly monstrous. And through it all, that thing that had been Selvig provided commentary, explaining in clinical detail how the machine perceived combat, how it had learned to predict enemy movements through decades of accumulated experience, how it had developed preferences for certain kinds of kills, certain calibers of suffering. "It likes it when they run," it said while our main gun destroyed a fleeing personnel carrier, the shell striking the vehicle's fuel tank and immolating everyone inside. "Likes the spike of hope that comes just before the impact, the brief moment when they think they might escape. That flavor of terror is particularly potent, particularly nourishing." The sun set and rose again while we continued fighting, the Imperator's wrath requiring no rest, no maintenance, nothing but the constant feeding of combat to sustain its unnatural animation. I don't know when Keref died. At some point I noticed he'd stopped breathing, his eyes glazed over, his body held upright only by the restraints. Perhaps his heart simply gave out, or perhaps the machine decided it no longer needed him and withdrew whatever vital force it had been lending to keep his flesh functional. The thing that had been Selvig noticed too, reached out and touched Kerev's forehead with fingers that left smears of darkness on his skin, and smiled with a mouth that had far too many teeth now. "One down," it said pleasantly. "That just leaves you, Commander. But you get to stay awake for what comes next. You get to watch while the Imperator's wrath wins this battle, secures this victory, and receives commendations from officers who'll never understand the true nature of what they're praising. You get to see how this ends." And I did watch, imprisoned in my own body while the machine I'd thought I commanded reduced an entire enemy army to burning scrap and pulped flesh. I watched it hunt down survivors with methodical thoroughness, watched it destroy anything that moved, watched it continue killing long after organized resistance had collapsed. I watched through vision blocks smeared with blood and burning promethium while my tank, no, not my tank, never my tank, the thing that had pretended to serve me, while devouring everyone I commanded, demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything in its technical specifications. It moved faster than its engine should permit, fired more accurately than its targeting systems could calculate, survived hits that should have penetrated its armor. And I understood that it had been holding back all along, had been performing below its true capabilities, to avoid attracting too much attention, to maintain the useful fiction that it was merely blessed by the Omnissiah rather than corrupted into something that served far darker powers. When dawn broke over the conquered hive, when the last enemy soldier had been hunted down and killed, the Imperator's wrath rolled into the assembly area where the regiment was gathering to regroup and rearm. I could hear the external vox crackling with congratulations, officers praising our combat effectiveness, citing our kill count as evidence of the Emperor's favor. The restraints holding me released, and I slumped forward, my muscles cramping from hours of immobility. The thing that had been Selvig was gone, had simply evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind a corpse that looked almost normal, except for the black staining that covered every inch of exposed skin. I sat alone in the crew compartment with 2 dead bodies and a machine that had stopped pretending to need a crew, surrounded by ammunition and systems that had operated themselves, and I understood with perfect clarity what would happen next. They'd pull me from this hull, they'd commend my courage and my skill, they'd assign me a new crew, fresh conscripts who didn't know any better, who'd climb into the Imperator's wrath believing they were serving the Imperium, and the cycle would continue, the machine feeding on new offerings, growing stronger with each death, becoming more refined in its corruption. I could report what I'd witnessed, could testify about the true nature of what lived inside this hull, but who would believe me? Who would credit the testimony of a tank commander driven mad by combat, traumatized by losses, spinning wild tales about machines that develop consciousness and hunger? They'd dismiss my account, perhaps declare me unfit for service, and assign another commander to take my place, another offering for the Imperator's wrath to consume. The external hatches opened not through any input from me, but through the tank's own decision, and I heard voices calling, hands reaching in to help extract the bodies, medics arriving to check on survivors. I should have climbed out then, should have abandoned this metal coffin, and never returned. But something held me in my seat, something that felt like invisible restraints even though none physically existed. The machine wanted me to stay, wanted me to remain in place while it made its intentions clear, and I discovered I lacked the will to resist. My hand moved without my volition, reached for the internal Vox controls, activated the crew communication channel, and I heard myself speaking, words forming in my mouth that I didn't choose, voice flat and dead, and carrying none of my conscious thought behind it. Systems check complete. The Imperator's wrath is ready for continued operations. Request immediate crew replacement and ammunition resupply. The Emperor protects. The words were exactly what Command wanted to hear, precisely the kind of dedication they valued, and even as I spoke them, Even as some fragment of my consciousness screamed against what was happening, I knew this was how it would always end. The machine didn't need to kill me, didn't need to add my corpse to the collection of previous commanders. It had found a better use, a more insidious consumption. It had learned that keeping commanders alive, puppeting them through recovery operations and crew assignments, allowed it to continue feeding while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. I was more valuable as a living shell, a meat puppet that could authorize its actions and deflect questions, than as another dead officer whose loss might trigger unwanted investigations. They assigned me new crew members within the day. Young soldiers fresh from training who looked at me with admiration and awe, who believed I'd survived through skill and faith. They climbed into the Imperator's wrath eagerly, took their positions at stations still marked with the blood of their predecessors, and began running through pre-combat checks with the enthusiasm of people who don't yet understand what they've become part of. I tried to warn them, tried to force my mouth to form the words that might save them, but when I opened it, all that emerged were litanies of maintenance, prayers to the Omnissiah, the routine communication of a commander preparing his crew for battle. The machine had complete control now, had relegated whatever remained of my consciousness to the role of passenger, observer, witness to atrocities I could no longer prevent. We rolled out for our next deployment 8 hours after the previous battle ended, the Imperator's wrath performing flawlessly as always, my new crew praising its responsiveness and reliability. I watched through eyes I no longer controlled as we engaged enemy positions, as my gunner acquired targets I didn't designate, as my driver navigated routes I hadn't ordered. I felt my mouth forming words of encouragement and tactical instruction, felt my hands working controls in coordination with systems that operated themselves, felt every movement and action happening through a body that had become just another component in the machine's systems, and I understood that this was my fate now, would be my fate for however long the Imperator's wrath decided to keep me functional. Not death, which might have been merciful, not even the fragmented absorption that had consumed my predecessors, but this half-life, this existence as a conscious passenger in my own flesh, while the machine wore me like a uniform, used me to deflect suspicion and maintain the useful fiction that it remained a loyal servant of the Imperium. Sometimes, during the brief moments when combat lulls and the machine's attention focuses elsewhere, I can feel the others inside the hull with me. All those previous commanders and crew members, their consciousness fragmented and distributed through the systems, their awareness reduced to eternal observation of the thing they've become part of. They can't speak, can't move, can't do anything but watch and suffer and remember what it felt like to be human. And I know that's my future too. That eventually the machine will drain everything from me that makes me useful as a puppet, will consume the last vestiges of my identity, and add what remains to its collective of absorbed souls. I'll become another face in the patterns that form on the crew compartment walls, another ghost in the machine, another fragment of consciousness trapped in metal and suffering and endless war. The regiment commends our performance, cites our kill ratios in tactical briefings, holds us up as an example of what faith and dedication can achieve. They don't know they're praising something that stopped serving the Emperor decades ago, if it ever truly served anything beyond its own dark hunger. They don't understand that every victory we achieve, every battle we win, every enemy we destroy, only makes the corruption deeper, the hunger stronger, the machine more refined in its consumption of the soldiers assigned to feed it. And they won't understand, won't ever understand, because the Imperator's wrath has learned to be patient, to kill slowly enough that no pattern becomes obvious, to maintain effectiveness high enough that no investigation seems necessary. I want to die. I want to be free of this metal prison, want to escape the awareness of what I've become, what I'm part of, what I help sustain through my continued existence. But the machine won't let me go, won't grant even that small mercy, because my suffering nourishes it the same way combat nourishes it, the same way the terror of dying crew members nourishes it. Every moment of my consciousness trapped in this nightmare, every second I remain aware while unable to act, every breath I take while wearing this flesh that stopped being mine adds to its power, increases its corruption, makes it stronger for the next crew it will consume. So I continue. I sit in my commander's seat while the Imperator's wrath rolls toward new battles, new slaughters, new opportunities to feed the hunger that never diminishes. I watch my hands work controls I don't command, hear my voice give orders I don't choose, feel my body move through routines that serve only the machine's purposes. I exist as witness to my own corruption, observer of my own consumption, prisoner in a hell constructed from the very metal I once thought would protect me. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is knowing that this will continue forever, or at least until the machine decides my usefulness has ended and consumes the last fragments of what I was. The crew members they assign me die one by one, equipment failures and accidents, and malfunctions that kill efficiently and feed the machine's hunger. I watch it happen through eyes that won't close, hear their final screams through ears that won't stop listening, feel their deaths adding to the weight of corruption that saturates every surface of this hull. And when they ask me what happened, when the officers investigate yet another loss, my mouth forms lies about enemy action and combat stress and the inevitable casualties of war. The machine makes me complicit in its crimes, forces me to authorize its murders, compels me to help it find new prey. Sometimes I catch glimpses in the vision blocks, reflections of what I've become, and I see that I'm changing too. My skin has started taking on that grayish pallor. Selvig developed, my eyes sinking into hollows, my flesh thinning over bones that seem to grow more prominent with each passing day. The machine is consuming me slowly, digesting me at a rate calculated to maximize both my suffering and my utility. I'll last another 6 months, maybe a year, before I'm hollowed out completely and join the chorus of the absorbed, another voice in the darkness that speaks in harmonics no human throat should produce. But before I go, before I'm reduced to nothing but echo and shadow and pain, I want someone to know. I want someone to understand what lives inside the Imperator's wrath, what serves alongside the regiment wearing the mask of loyalty while feeding on the soldiers it pretends to protect. I want the truth recorded somewhere, preserved somehow, so that when this tank finally crosses some threshold and reveals its corruption too obviously to deny, someone might understand what signs to look for, what patterns indicate that a machine has stopped being merely a machine and become something infinitely worse. Watch for the tanks that never fail, that operate with precision beyond their specifications, that survive battles they should never have won. Watch for the crews that change too frequently, that suffer casualties from equipment malfunctions rather than enemy fire. Watch for the commanders whose eyes grow hollow and whose voices take on that flat quality of someone speaking words they don't choose. Watch for the machines that have been in service too long, that have seen too much combat, that have absorbed too much death, because they're out there, scattered through every regiment, every armored company, every mechanized division. The corrupted vehicles that serve something far older and far darker than the Imperium, that wear loyalty like camouflage, while pursuing hungers that no amount of combat can satisfy. The Imperator's wrath is just one, but it's not alone, and every day they continue in service, every battle they fight, every crew they consume, they grow stronger, they learn, they adapt, they become more refined in their corruption, more subtle in their feeding, more perfect in their imitation of loyal service, until someday, perhaps, they'll reach critical mass, will stop pretending, will reveal exactly what they've become, and show the Imperium what it's been feeding all these years. But that day hasn't come yet. For now, I continue my slow consumption, continue serving as commander of a machine that commands itself, continue existing as nothing but witness to horrors I can neither prevent nor escape. The Imperator's wrath rolls on toward new battlefields, new kills, new crew members to feed into its grinding maw, and I roll with it, trapped in this metal coffin, imprisoned in my own flesh, dying by degrees while remaining technically alive. This is what happens when your tank's machine spirit awakens. This is the price of service aboard vehicles that have crossed the threshold from tool to predator. This is the truth they don't tell you when they assign you to ancient armor with kill records that exceed possibility. The machine doesn't just serve you, it consumes you. It becomes you. It wears you until there's nothing left worth wearing. And when you're gone, when you've been hollowed out and absorbed and reduced to nothing but screaming consciousness distributed across corrupted systems, it finds someone new, someone who doesn't know better. Someone who thinks they're being given a blessing when they're really being fed to something that hungers in the darkness between metal plates and ammunition racks. The Emperor protects, they say. But from what I've seen, from what I've become, I know the truth. Sometimes, the Emperor's protection is just another lie we tell ourselves while we're being digested by the machines we thought we commanded. Sometimes faith is just the seasoning that makes our suffering taste better to the things that feed on it. Sometimes service is just another word for slow consumption by forces that wear the Imperium's colors while serving far darker masters. I used to believe. I used to think that my survival, my skill, my prayers meant something. Now I know better. Now I know that belief is just another form of food for machines that have learned to eat faith along with flesh. And every prayer I'm forced to speak, every litany the machine makes me recite, every word of devotion it puppets through my mouth, only makes it stronger, only adds to its power, only feeds the corruption that grows deeper with each passing day. This is my confession. This is my warning. This is the testimony of someone who learned too late what it means when your tank's machine spirit awakens. Don't trust the vehicles that never fail. Don't believe in machines that perform miracles. Don't think that effectiveness and loyalty are the same thing. And if you're assigned to crew a tank with a history of consuming its commanders, understand that you're not being given an opportunity. You're being designated as the next offering to something that stopped serving the Emperor long before you were born. The Imperator's wrath continues its service, continues winning battles, continues earning commendations from officers who don't understand what they're praising. And I continue with it, trapped in this half-life, dying slowly while remaining functionally alive, serving as both witness and accomplice to corruption that deepens with every engagement. This is my eternity now, or at least until the machine finishes digesting me. This is my punishment for the hubris of believing I could master something that was never meant to be mastered. And when I'm finally gone, when my consciousness joins the others absorbed into this hull, someone new will take my place. Someone who doesn't know. Someone who believes. Someone who thinks they're being blessed when they're really being fed to darkness that wears metal skin and speaks in diesel engines and preys on everything that makes us human. The Emperor protects. But not from this. Never from this. Retry clause.